Yeah, no, I was about to move it off to get it out of your way and then realized it was yours.
So I had Karen, and then Laleh, and then yes, then
The leg at the end.
Leg.
Oh, okay.
Water's all fresh. I just
I
poured
have
tea. Okay.
Thank you. I just not. Elizabeth said she just poured
I just poured all that water.
Okay, if I can ask the people still in the hall if they can come in. Okay, thank you. So we've had a really interesting and challenging set of presentations to date, and I'm sure you're still thinking about some of that data and some of that vision and other things. One of the great questions, of course, is who's going to do all of this work? Because you know, some of us don't have that many years of engineering left in us, so we kind of need to have, as they say in Quebec, la relève, who are going to pick up tools and go, and they're going to come from a whole variety of places, and to a certain extent, given that of all the professions, we are probably the least inclusive and equal, and the rest, we have lots of room for improvement and bringing more people in. So I am very interested to hear the discussion of the next panel of some of the initiatives and the approaches and how the EDI issues, as we tend to call them, are being addressed in the current program. So I will hand this off to Elizabeth and let you take it from here. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. I would like to again begin by acknowledging and respecting the Lekwungans peoples on whose territory we gather, and the Songhees and Esquimalt peoples who have lived on and cared for this land in the past, present, and future, and also pay my respects to the Saanich people who have important relationships with the land that the University of Victoria stands on, and the place where I teach, research, and work with colleagues for a better and fairer world. My name is Elizabeth Croft. I am a settler in these territories. I grew up in Vancouver on the territory of the Musqueam people and currently make my home in Oak Bay in Lekwungen territory. As an academic and as a professional engineer, I have been engaged in questions of diversity and inclusion for my entire career, and these questions have shaped my work as I've served in various roles at UBC, at Monash University, and now at UVic. They've been very important to me during my time as NSERC Chair for Women in Science and Engineering in the BC Yukon region, which was between 2010 and 2015. And I wanted to moderate this program because the questions of equity, diversity, and inclusion have actually only become more central to the engineering profession during the last 10 years. And with the introduction of the BC Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, we can no longer drag our heels on reconciliation and decolonization in our work. This is an immediate reality, and our profession must act now or actually be in jeopardy of running afoul of this legislation, as much of our work on the land directly intersects with the requirements of this act, among other items. Meanwhile, we have a shortage of engineers in this province, yet our systems and structures continue to create barriers for people who are foreign trained to join the profession, and for people who are here in our country, but we don't welcome into our profession. So that is the framing for the discussion today. And thanks to my colleagues who have agreed, we have an amazing panel today who can speak in an expert fashion to the questions and the framing of this panel. Their bios should be in your program, but I will actually ask each of them to introduce themselves from the way that they wish to in a moment. But our panel members are Jessica Vandenberghe, who is on Zoom, and also to my right, Karen Savage, Laleh Behjat, and Kevin Hall. So the thing I would like to start with, if I could, is to ask each of our colleagues, so maybe starting with Jessica, if you would be so kind as to introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me all right? Yes. Wonderful. So I'm joining you today from the Traditional Territory Treaty 6 in Métis Nation Zone number 4 from Amiskwaci, Waskahagan, also known as Edmonton, Alberta. So my name is Jessica Vandenberghe, as shared. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a member of the Denetah First Nation in Treaty 8 territory in Northern Alberta. My life and my career journey has gone many places. I've been privileged and honored to be part of many conversations in the equity, diversity, inclusion, and truth and reconciliation space. I am formally trained as a chemical engineer. I hold 2 engineering degrees from the University of Alberta. I took the co-op program, worked in a number of different industries, and landed to do an oil sands research career for about 10 years. During my time as a student, as an engineer in training, as a professional engineer, not all my experiences were great. And so my side volunteer work and advocacy work was always in the equity, diversity, inclusion space. And when I had children, I was even more motivated to work in this space. I worked for APEGA, our engineering regulator here in Alberta, for about 6 years in a variety of director positions, working on things like the 30 by 30, creating that a national movement, creating guidelines, working on things like salary survey. I worked in the compliance enforcement side of things, permit to practice, creating professional practice guidelines for professional practice plans, and chairing a number of national boards through Engineers Canada. After that, I moved into the reconciliation space more fully. I am a 60 scoop survivor, which means I grew up in the foster adoption system. I wanted to explore my heritage a little bit more and see for myself the state of affairs of First Nations, Métis communities, and Inuit communities. I worked as a consultant for First Nations, Métis settlements, Métis nations on a variety of projects, from infrastructure projects to policy work to grant infrastructure initiatives with the provincial and federal governments, all sorts of things in that space. And it was truly heartbreaking to see firsthand the state of affairs and see the children and see the families, see communities that were safe and thriving and others in the very opposite. COVID struck, as you know, and I moved to the University of Alberta and joined their Dean's office in the Faculty of Engineering as initially Assistant Dean Outreach, later renamed Assistant Dean Engineering, Community and Culture. I worked in that position for 3 years, and then recently joined the University of Victoria in the Faculty of Engineering and Computer Science as Assistant Dean, Community and Culture. Again, still working in the equity, diversity, inclusion, truth, reconciliation space, and really working for our students and providing the best student experience that we can. That's a little bit about me, and so I'll pass it back to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I'll now turn to my colleague, Karen Savage.
Good afternoon. My name is Karen Savage. I refrain from sharing my pronouns because they do not define me. However, for the record, I believe that both sexuality and gender are best described as spectra, and that the sharing of this information is a personal choice. I was born on the lands of the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples to 5th-generation settlers. I birthed my family on the shores of the Salish Sea, the rich, incomparable broth of which nourishes abundant life and which has nourished the peoples and cultures of the Songhees and Esquimalt lands upon which we are currently located, and of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples upon whose lands I continue to live and work. I raised my family to walk gently upon these lands, to respect these waters, and to recognize and honor the footprints of the coastal Salish peoples. I acknowledge that the lifestyle that my family enjoys is a result of colonialism, the cost of which was borne by others, particularly those First Nations from whom and with whom reconciliation is sought. I have worked hard in my chosen profession of engineering. I have navigated this white man's world carefully, cognizant of the fact that I have been a role model and must not fail, whether by lack of diligence, patience, understanding, sensitivity, or courage. In 1997, I founded a geotechnical engineering consultancy, Horizon Engineering, which was acquired in 2021 by RAM Consulting. I acknowledge that my success relates to my whiteness. Throughout my career, I have sought to enhance diversity in engineering locally, provincially, and nationally, recognizing that our profession cannot adequately serve society unless we reflect it. Thank you.
Please
So-
go ahead, sorry.
Yeah.
Next is Laleh.
So I'm Laleh Behjat. My pronouns are she, her. And I live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Treaty 7 region in the heart of southern Alberta and Métis Nation Region 3. I am actually an immigrant to Canada, a settler. I come from Iran, and I did my bachelor's there, and I did my master's and Ph.D. at the University of Waterloo. My research is on building computers, so I actually develop software tools to automatically make computer hardware. But at the same time, I have many other interests, so I'm one of those people who has a lot of range. I have worked on engineering education. I have been an advisor to Google Computer Science Education Advisory Board. And I am also currently working on finding measures for understanding better data collection and analysis for equity, diversity, and inclusivity, as well as sustainable development. And then in 2020, I was appointed as the NSERC Chair for Women in Science and Engineering for the Prairie region.
Thank you, Laleh. And over to Kevin Hall, please.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I'm Kevin Hall from the University of Victoria. I wanted to also pay my respects to the Lekwungen peoples on whose homelands we're sitting right now. In fact, where you're sitting used to be the most productive clam beds in this country, and it was backfilled as they dredged the harbor out. And so it's always good to know where we're sitting. I came here in 2020 during the pandemic to be the president at UVic, and before I came, I requested permission to live and work on the land, and was humbled and privileged to be granted that permission to live and work here. I'm a civil engineer by training. In fact, a coastal engineer. Somebody mentioned coastal engineering this morning. That was my first piece of my profession. I've moved into public health. I was the chair of the Institute for Public Health at Queen's. And I've worked in photonics, detecting bacteria, so a little bit of everything. I've spent my academic career between Canada and Australia, and have sort of picked hopefully the best from both systems, and hopefully leave behind the worst from both systems. As the head of civil engineering at Queen's University, tackling diversity within our school was a priority for me back in the late 1990s. And sadly, we haven't moved the bar very much in engineering across the country. When you look at the numbers, I'll maybe talk about that a little later on. I've had a lifelong interest in access to education, and that's where, for me, the direct intersection with diversity and inclusivity happens. And I've also got a personal reason for being concerned about equity, diversity, and inclusivity, and that my partner is a woman of color. And I've lived through the trials and tribulations of a woman of color being in an academic career, and hopefully that provides me with a little guidance.
Okay, so thank you very much. I'm now going to ask each of our panels to put forward their position statement on EDI in engineering, and I'm hoping, colleagues, that you would try to keep your remarks down to 3 minutes, as I warned you, so that we can also have some time for some questions that I've prepared for you, and also some audience questions. So maybe, again, we'll start with Jessica, and then we'll move over to our other colleagues, please.
Thank you so much. When it comes to equity, diversity, and inclusion, this space is ever dynamic and ever changing. It's complicated and complex because we as individuals are complicated. We have our feelings and our emotions that make us human and give us life itself, gives the joy to life itself. And those are ever changing in the moment, and trying to interpret where and how they come from is difficult at times. When I think about equity, diversity, inclusion in the engineering profession, I know from my own lived experience, inclusivity wasn't always there. These conversations, now that I am more educated in the space of colonialism and how Canada's founding plays into how we came to where we are, is just fascinating. When we think of colonialism and the gender discrimination that was at the beginning of the founding of this country, it plays a huge factor today. At that time, of course, not even recognizing all the genders and sexes that we recognize today weren't even part of the conversation. When it comes to First Nations, Métis, Inuit people, colonization resulted in cultural genocide and assimilation, along with a lot of horrific death and abuse and all sorts of things that we are all learning and seeking the truth about what happened, and still dealing with the healing, nonetheless moving forward in terms of equity and inclusivity. There's a lot in all of these spaces that needs to be thought about, and it always starts with introspection first, our own awareness, coming aware of our own privileges and our own biases, and then looking outward to see what we can do to shift systems in which racism exists, in which colonialism is quite founded, especially in places like our academic institutions, or even other systems like enforcement systems or the legal system, or government systems, decision-making systems, things like this. But we are now in a time where conversations have shifted from equality to equity. And that is a tough conversation to have, because again, it's not only facing those biases and privileges, it's also having conversations now around what feels very unfair. So often equity feels unfair to folks who have sat in places of authority or power, or have been comfortable in the so-called perks, I guess, of those of the systems that we live in. Even access to education is such a privilege, and in an academic institution, we're surrounded by everyone who has higher education, and sometimes we forget that education is a privilege, that access is not so easy for everybody in every demographic. And now we are also in a time where we want to make sure that we model inclusive, respectful behavior, but now we see cisgendered white men under the microscope. And I know that's an uncomfortable place to be. Having been the only female Indigenous engineer in many rooms, I know what it feels like to be under the microscope. But we also want to make sure that we bring everybody along in the conversation. There are certain systems that will never leave us. Capitalism is one of them, for example. And so how do we work with that? And so what I really want to say is that it's complicated, it's dynamic. We're in a comfortable stage where a lot of truths are still coming out, and terminology and everything is still forming. But it's open conversations. It's coming to the table to hear a variety of opinions, and really not invalidating how it feels to certain demographics that will move us forward in reciprocity. So thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm going to turn next to Karen Savage.
I believe, and research bears this out, that diversity enhances excellence, full stop. Pipelines to the C-suite should be populated with a diverse cohort, and recruiters should be active in pursuing candidates to ensure that every slate is as rich and multidimensional as possible. This is meritocracy in action, and will result in the individual selected being of a higher caliber than if the slate were to be narrowly predetermined. I believe that those with a voice should create space for others to be heard. This means creating a physical opening in a conversation circle, asking someone their opinion or to share worthwhile information that you know they possess so that they can be validated, complimenting someone who shares a good idea, not presenting it as your own a few minutes later when they are not heard, attributing a previous comment which is a building block to what you are about to say, and not isolating a conversation at elevation 6'2". because if you do that, you won't hear from people like Senator Galvez. I believe that students choose not to enter engineering not because it could be more inclusive or more diverse, but because they are unaware of this profession. Prior to starting a family, I was a volunteer with scientists in the schools and refined several workshops on K-12 curricular topics, including community structures and simple machines, and I will say those are engineering workshops. And for grades 2, 3, and 4 respectively. And grades 4 to 7 is when a lot of girls especially become unwilling to excel in math and science. So I think getting that knowledge and ownership of tools and language is important to share at that age. I'll just share that I will share these examples, okay? So in grade 2 community, I shared Kate Braid's poem, Recipe for a Sidewalk, where we used a drill to mix concrete for paving stones, which we then decorated. And I also shared my recipe for wacky chocolate cake. Actually, it was my husband's recipe, where we used an electric mixer, which if you bake and mix concrete, you know these are very similar tools. In grade 3 structures, I shared images of skeletons, and we talked about human towers, simply supported beam tigers, and double cantilever Tyrannosaurus rex. Then we built structures or boats using straws, foil, and tape, which we then test loaded with a bowl full of rocks. The lesson was cemented when I showed them how I could use straws as end-bearing piles to support the bowl of rocks on a surface of a dish of chocolate pudding, which we then ate, and which 20 years later, they still remember. In grade 4, simple machines, I taught the class the proper names for slot, Phillips, and Robertson screwdrivers, vice grips, pliers, needle nose pliers, and crescent wrenches, which we then used to dismantle non-functioning household appliances in order to identify inclined planes, wedges, levers, screws, wheels and axles, and pulleys. And again, it gave the children ownership of the tools and comfort in utilizing them and terminology to embrace their use. Perhaps because of this, there is one woman engineer from each of my kids' grade school cohorts, and I know this to be statistically significant. Of course, I went on to do lots of other things, but I treasure that success, and I love it when I hear about a young woman that was in one of my kids' classes and that has entered the profession that we share. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Karen. Laleh, please.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to talk about the several reasons, but the last one is the most important one, of course. But the first one is that having more equity and diversity and inclusion increases the pool of talent that we have. So how many people know Elsie McGill, or Dr. Elsie McGill? Yeah, so she was a fantastic doctor. She got her doctorate in aeronautics engineering. And during the World War, she was the one who actually designed Hurricane airplanes. And she had polio when she was younger, so she was not only a woman in a work that was dominated by men, but she was also disabled. She couldn't walk very well. She had to use crutches all the time. But she would still go on every plane ride to test the vibrations of to feel them, to see how she could make them better. Now, in the middle of the World War, they actually had to fire her. And the reason for firing her was that she made a mistake of falling in love and wanting to marry a man who was working at the same time. So married women could not work. So later on, Elsie McGill actually went and wrote the first report on the status of women and children in Canada. So she's done a lot of contribution. But her contributions during the World War could have actually done a lot more. And now we are talking about World War. I also want to mention Alan Turing, who designed the Turing test, was code breaker or the mastermind behind breaking the codes for the Germans. And he was, after the war, because he was homosexual, he was chemically castrated, and because of the effect of that, he actually committed suicide. So there were two very, very talented people who were taken out of the pool of talent. Now, this is not considering people like my grandmother who never actually got the opportunity to even go past elementary school, because at that time there was no money to support her to go to school, so she was married off. So just sort of thinking about all the people we are losing, the talent we are losing by not actually including people or excluding them. The second one is that it increases the team intelligence, and this is something that is shown by psychologists. I'm going to skip over this a little bit, but I would be happy to talk about it later on. It also brings new perspective into the research. So Dr. Meena Mankara, she's a woman, she wears hijab, and she's a biochemist, and she's also blind. But because she was blind, she could actually understand the vibrations of how proteins and drugs combine together. Because how the chemists do this is that they actually find the binding, and then they look at the model that the computer has generated. Now, she's blind, she couldn't look at the model, and so she actually had to write a mathematical equations for this, and because of those, she found these vibrations. I wanted to just quickly finish up by saying that now, these are some examples, and examples don't prove anything. But we all, as scientists and engineers, we all believe in the scientific method. And the scientific method, we cannot actually disregard things that we don't like or we don't see. And we know if we do this, there would be very, very significant challenges, problems for us. So, for example, Challenger blew up because we forgot to consider temperature. The very cold temperatures. And so if we think about EDIA as part of, as not only as something that we should consider once we are doing research, but as part of the perspectives that this research can bring, and the people who can actually see those blind spots that we all have, or the expertise that we don't have, and bring them to the table, and that's how we can do excellent engineering and research.
Thank you. Over to Kevin, please.
Yeah, thanks. And I thought it's just important to start off by saying, obviously, as a white, cisgendered, heterosexual male, I'm at the apex of privilege. And I think about that every day I'm in my role, the privilege I have, and how can I take that privilege and turn that into action that's actually trying to make things a little bit better. And some of the things I found work are, first of all, sharing power. So quite often I will not chair committees. I will associate to somebody else to chair committees. I will make sure there's space for people to have a voice. But it still doesn't deflect from the fact that people look at me and can be, you know, I guess put in a difficult place because of the power they feel that I may have. And so that's a really important thing for me to state. I want to talk a little bit about accessibility, and what I find really sad about Canada, quite frankly, is participation rates at university are the same as they were 30 years ago based on Stats Canada. It's about 32% of the population. It's the same people going to university. They all look and come from the same backgrounds for the most part. And it's sad to me that we haven't been able to crack, you know, how do we get a more diverse population into our schools? So everything from the way we admit students, typically, you know, particularly in engineering, the higher the marks, the better you are, and that's absolutely what we've got to get away from, I think. And we do the same thing with the recruitment of our academic staff. We often say, look, we're prepared to look at somebody perhaps with a little less experience because we want to create diversity amongst our academics, but when the rubber hits the road and we go to hire, it's always, well, so-and-so hasn't worked at a big university, or you can't be a provost because you haven't been a dean, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're not very good at executing. The other thing I thought I would just talk about my perspective of universities, being there for 40 years in the university system. So we talk a lot now about equity, diversity, and inclusivity. And equity and diversity we're really good at, we think, at universities because they're numbers games. But where we fall flat is the inclusivity part. We hear time and time again how uncomfortable people feel on campus, that racism is alive and well on our campus. One thing I found about Australia was it's overt and in your face. In Canada, it's an underground microaggression passive-aggressive type of movement. And it's something we've had to deal with at UVic. We've just created a new equity action plan. We use what is called equity-centered design to build a plan, and it was created and crafted by people who have been marginalized on our campus, and it calls us to task, and it says we're not perfect. There's little small things like language, and I was just, going to mention here, a number of people used the term white paper this morning. That's a piece of language we don't use anymore. It's not a position paper, perhaps, but it's not a white paper. And simple things like those small things exist at our university and all universities all the time. And we've got to look at how we deal with that. I thought I'd finish with, we as universities are part of the problem, particularly with engineering. But I think there's other actors involved that I'd like to really call to task. And first, it starts with our accreditation bodies. It starts with the CEAB. It starts with our provincial regulatory agencies who write lots about being diverse and being inclusive, write lots about being welcoming, but actually don't put either funds into it or don't put actions into place. And some of the actions I'm thinking about really are forcing companies, forcing engineers who are licensed, forcing universities who are training students to have more of their own training around diversity, inclusivity, and even policies for like accreditation. And I've just got some numbers to give to you today, and I'll finish off with that if I might have 30 more seconds. I'm going to use 1980 and 2020 as two connecting dates. And I use 1980 because I might have graduated somewhere around that time. But in 1980, there were 25% of the medical students in this country were female. In 2020, 51% were female. In veterinary medicine in 1980, 11% of the students were female. In 2020, 80% of veterinary medicine students are female. Ocean science, 1980, 16%. 2020, 60%. Engineering, 1980, 3% of students were female. And we've got our way up to 14.4% across this country. So why are we so different than those other three professions? And I think it's because the regulatory agencies have not pushed all of us in this room towards the diversity and inclusivity we need. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to reply to that. if I
Thank
may.
you. Please go ahead. The game is afoot.
So I'm an appointee to Engineers Canada Qualifications Board, and I've been on EGBC Council. I think that there have been strides made in both of those organizations. Certainly, Engineers Canada has been working towards 30 by 30 not soon enough, and so it won't be achieved in the way it was first intended. And EGBC has now EDI guidelines, as does Engineers Canada. But I would say that what we need to talk about is workplace safety, WorkSafe BC, and the other provincial WorkSafe regulators. And we need to talk about cultural safety. Workplace safety should not just relate to physical safety. It needs to relate to other types of safety. And I think it was maybe even mentioned yesterday in one of the conversations I had. I'm attributing this comment, but I can't remember who said it. But that if a workplace has an accident, then its premiums go up. If a workplace has an issue with harassment and bullying, then its premium should go up. It's, if you have an economic incentive, then the change will happen. Thank you.
All right. Any other people want to weigh in on that? I thought that was a very interesting comment. And I think there's, my own personal take is I think there's some work that CEAB and the regulators do need to do to push us. And also to unstuff our curriculum so we can have the space for the important things that we need to do. But I agree that, economics is part of it. Yeah, Laleh?
I won't put all the blame on us as profession. I mean, like, how many shows do you see where there is women doctors? how many shows do you see when there's women engineers? Like it is in the culture as well as the systems we have. The other thing could be that it is easier to be a doctor and work on your own versus to be part of a company organization. And so what happens is that generally women, and especially women of color, get a lot less opportunities to advance. So even if you go to engineering, then it could become harder for you to advance, and then so you might pivot to some other professions. In the engineering education, we have a concept that this is very hard. So the students who are coming to this, like especially the girls who want to go to engineering will say, well, I've got to go to this really hard degree. Our sort of Frosh Week and all the things that the students do in there is like really, really very sexist. Some of them they have changed a lot in the past years, but it's not from 1980 to maybe 10 years ago. They were just the same. And so the kids are smart. They see these things and they just choose to go to some other profession that might be kinder.
I'd like to make space for Jessica to be heard, if she has something to say.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, definitely there's a role for everyone to play. In this space, we always say no shame, blame, or guilt. We have to hold ourselves to our own account. I agree, the regulators do need to be stronger. I know the accreditation board does need to shift and change, and they're undergoing their 6-year review right now of the accreditation system, of which I've been at those conversations to talk about equity, diversity, inclusion, and truth reconciliation. So they are being considered for what that looks like in the future. Which is good. That does need to change to loosen up the reins so that curriculum can shift and change as well. It is complicated though, but we always need to start with ourselves in our own organizations. So if you are sitting in a leadership position, you need to hold your teams to account, yourself to account, to role model what is needed, and you need to take your organization in the direction it needs to go in order to make this come true. And that means putting aside at times the capacity and time and resources against it when you feel the pull towards something else, right? So if you're going to say it's a priority, actually actioning it and making it a priority, because we do see it in all sorts of plans, strategies, business plans, but when the rubber hits the road, time is put towards production or capitalistic pursuits rather than team building and holding people to account and performance management and all of that. So we got to hold what is in our control to account first. The larger bodies, there is work underway. Does it ever go as fast as we want it to? No, it doesn't. But it is underway, which does give me some hope in this space. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessica. I think that leads into a question that I had wanted to ask the panel, which is, how important are workplace policies on EDI, on recruitment and retention and building an inclusive workplace? And maybe if you can refer to successful policies or practices that you have seen in workplaces that can help us move the dial on these items. Anybody want to pick that up? And Jessica, if you can wave if you want. I can sort of see you out of the corner of my eye.
Sounds good. Happy to go first, so you
Sure.
don't have to
Thank
look around and see me wave. But when it comes to workplace policy, again, the biggest thing that makes a difference is accountability, making it part of performance management. I know it feels, for those who are of a different opinion around the importance of equity, diversity, inclusion, or a different place of learning and their own lived experience, keeps them in that fear zone rather than the learning or growth zone. It will feel intrusive and there'll be some strong opinions voiced against it. But if your company and your leadership can hold people to account for respectful, inclusive behavior, it makes a huge difference. And we need to model that ourselves. So for me, workplace policy that ties it into accountability and performance management goes a long ways in this space. We can talk to many other things that are leading practice for equitable practice in terms of spiritual days or health and wellness supports, benefits that support people. For example, I'll give the example of those who come from First Nations communities. Death is one of those things that walk with us because of residential schools, because of intergenerational trauma, because of day schools, because of so many different things. And it's not, you know, grandmother passes away at 94 surrounded by her loving family passings. It is murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. It's exposure to the elements. It is people who have given into addictions, people whose passings are unexpected and sometimes horrific. The average organizational policy for grieving and bereavement will often not give a person the amount of time that they need to, number one, travel to a remote community, number two, take part in the ceremony, the traditional ceremony that goes with passing for the right amount of time. And often people's passings, if you were raised by your grandmother or your aunties, as per traditional practice and community at times, doesn't even qualify for bereavement leave. So as a First Nations person, having connected with my home family and community and the deaths that I'm told of multiple times per year, I can't even go to grieve with the community, nonetheless take part in the ceremony. And when we talk about the effect of that on a person's mental health, and then their ability to work clearly, if you've ever lost anybody, you know grief is something that is hard. First Nations, Métis, Inuit walk with grief pretty much consistently. And there are things in there when I think about, for example, my sister and her son burning to death in their house. These things take time, they take professional help to work through the trauma of these things. And it's something that isn't considered necessarily in a standard organizational policy. So if we think about equitable policy, that's just one example of many. So I'll let my other panelists speak to this as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessica, for sharing that with us. Colleagues, yes, Kevin, please.
Yeah, I think for me, policies can be good, but it's the execution of the policies that has to be done. And quite often you don't think through the policies and all of the implications. So, you know, we have a preferential hiring policy, but we'll often bring people to a campus that's not actually ready for those people to come. They don't feel like they belong, they don't feel included. So there's that part of the policy. The second piece for me is policies are often places where people hide behind. You know, I've been 2.5 years at UVic, probably had a dozen cases of people who haven't been found guilty of racism because they haven't met the threshold that the policy sets out. So we have to think really hard about policies. We have to think, how do they get enacted? You know, how do they get empowered? And do we have the right bar to measure things? Because policy can just be this place where you park yourself and you're okay. You haven't crossed a line.
Thank you.
I'd like to speak from the perspective of a smaller engineering firm. Engineers really DIY a lot, and they DIY HR issues, and probably not very well. When I had my firm, we only had one policy, and it was we don't design timber retaining walls. And and I think that lack of policy is really common for smaller firms. But what I have seen to be effective, so I can't speak to policy in a larger organization, but what I have seen to be effective is I participate in a monthly phone call of ACEC CEOs, and it's there's about eight people, and 7 men and me, and they're the bigger civil or geotechnical firms in BC. And what is effective, yeah, now you're doing the math, trying to figure out who they are. I'll tell you later. Looking up, counting. What I have seen to be truly effective is making it competitive and having a champion. And I've really admired and looked to Steve Hedberg of BGC, because he is really comfortable bringing issues of, you know, we're having trouble with retention of women, or we're having trouble with recruitment of women, to the CEO group, who probably wouldn't even have it on the radar before, but he brings it, and he has bar graphs and charts, and then the next month, everybody else is sharing their bar graphs and charts, and it becomes a bit of a competitive environment. So having a champion and making things competitive is something that I found to be actually effective. Thank you.
Just to quickly add, I think policy, like good policies, are just a minimum. But what we really need to do is once we have the good policies, we have to also make sure that the culture changes. And I think that goes to what you're saying. The biggest problem is that there's lots of privileges that people have. And the problem with privilege is that when you have the privilege, you won't see it because it's not unseen, because it's something you have, and only losing it means that you have you find out that might find out that it was a privilege. Generally, people think that losing that privilege is a disadvantage. So that's when you have a policy that takes away that privilege, the privilege to be always on the table versus having to sort of share the chair, for example, then the people who lose the privilege that they had will start feeling a sort of oh, I am now being disadvantaged, and that can actually work against that cultural change. So I think once you have the policies, you also have to follow it with actions that will bring in people together to work collaboratively together, to build those trusts and understanding of issues, and how we can actually work together to have all the voices included.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take Chair's privilege to ask one more question before I open it up to the audience. And I think one of the things that we have to recognize is that, we've spoken about gender, but there's really intersectionality, right? There's gender, there's race, there's social economic advantage and disadvantage. So how, in this complex situation, do we acknowledge that intersectionality and the interconnected nature of various social identities and experiences in addressing EDI and working towards a more inclusive profession? Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Well, I will start because there's silence. So when I started in engineering, I was the first woman that when I walked onto a site, I was the only woman on the site and the first woman that a lot of anyone else on site had ever seen on site, and I would get butterflies in my stomach. And then I would go to the far end of the site where the excavation shoring contractors were, and they were my buddies, and they still are. But I felt like I kind of had a double whammy of youth and gender, and I wasn't sure how much was youth and how much was gender. Now I'm engineer of record for BC Hydro Terminal Station being constructed in northern BC, and I was out on site with one of my engineers who's Tamil, and I was just kind of like setting the stage to open a dialogue in case she had issues, so I shared that experience and said, and you've got like a triple whammy, right? Without like naming it, but kind of, because I wasn't super comfortable with that, but just kind of opening that discussion so that she hopefully feels comfortable in coming to me if there's any issues that develop on site, and just affirming for her that she may encounter those issues, and as we shared when we were younger, affirming each other, yes, that did happen to you, and it was the way you thought it was. And
it was sexist, Karen. Yes.
Yeah, so that's my contribution to this topic. I look to my panelists to.
I can go next, maybe.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I come originally from Iran, and so I'm in the intersection of sort of a race or immigration and also being a woman in the STEM. And there's a lot of talk that we have equity, diversity, inclusion, and then a sense of belonging. And any time that you talk about a sense of belonging, I start to sort of cringe, really, really hard reaction. And I didn't say this to anyone for a long time, and then I decided that I should actually talk about it. Because in Iran, a woman isn't their own person, they belong to someone, or they belong to their husband, to their father's family, or whatever, husband's family. So a sense of belonging for me is a very oppressive sense. Now, you would not know this at all, because you put my worldview into your own worldview, and so look at it that way. So I think in terms of intersectionality, for those of us who are in position of power, we should actually be able to talk about it. So I can talk about it, but maybe somebody else who is a graduate student might not be able to talk about this. Maybe they have the same feeling or different one, I don't know. But if I talk about it, then they will be able to also open up the space for them, a space for dialogue. The other one is to be able to listen and ask people. So one of the biggest things that makes a team really high performing is people being able to read each other's feelings without actually asking, are you angry, are you unhappy, or what happened? Without verbalizing it to understand what other people think. And so that is sort of comes back to, if you're feeling something is wrong, maybe open up a place, a safe place, a brave place for people to have those dialogues. And so that way we can actually understand each other's experiences, the intersection of different places that we live, and then maybe that way we can actually get to some better working.
Okay, I'm just going to check. Jessica, do you want to jump in? And then we'll go to Kevin.
Sure. Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. I just want to build off of what Laleh was saying, again, building of safe, brave places is really at the crux of where we need to go. Intersectionality is one of those things where we don't want to get too lost in it, because it's not a race to who has been hurt the most. This is always what I say in these spaces. It's not, I grew up with childhood trauma. You might have grown up in a low socioeconomic community, or perhaps I know that we work in an international world. People might have escaped world war in war-stricken countries to come to this country. We don't know all of each other's stories, and we're not always all comfortable sharing everything about ourselves. But if we grow safe, brave places where we can say, you know what, I have things that have happened to me. It might be because of my identifiers or not. But this is what I need, is what we need to strive towards. And what I really want to hit home on this one is that the need for proper engagement and consultation is crucial. We need to embrace the teaching of humility in order to say, okay, we're going to launch this policy. It's meant to be an inclusive practice or an equitable practice. And then it's asking the people who may have been at the table or not, to say, what do you think of this policy? Is it meeting everybody's needs? If we do a better job as professional engineers in engagement and consultation with all voices and demographics that haven't traditionally been engaged with, rather than us as engineers saying, oh, we know what they must think, and embrace that humility teaching, it will make a huge difference in launching effective, inclusive practice and equitable practice. And so I wanted to really state that proper engagement, consultation, and putting the resources towards that is vital.
Thank you, Jessica. Over to Kevin.
Yeah, look, I think we're all smart people, right? We've gone through engineering programs, but somehow we disconnect knowing that diversity is a great thing for an organization. Diversity of people give you diversity of thought, diversity of solutions, et cetera, et cetera. But we fall short on the execution, and I think for two areas for me. For academia, it's, let's call it student recruitment. For companies, it's your recruiting of employees. And we often, again, use this bar I mentioned earlier. We take marks, and we don't look at people's opportunities up to the points where they've got those marks in high school, or perhaps not even high school. And one of the things I took away from Australia, I think is very powerful, is you don't even have to graduate from university to get into engineering, or to get into medicine, or to get into whatever it is you want to get into. You can go back as a mature student. You can take a pathway program that will bring you up to the level of a second-year student. And the students that go in through these pathways are more successful than the students that come right from high school. My university in Newcastle had 50,000 students. 60% were mature students. 40% were school leavers, as I call them. UVic were 93% from high school. And so we have to work on that portion of the population and say, you might not have had the opportunity for that great education, but you're really smart and we can help you. And the second is when we look at things like promotion at the university or within your own companies. Again, we in spirit say, yes, we will consider somebody from a marginalized group with less experience, but my experience at multiple universities is when you get down to those decisions, you give up on those principles too easily. And it's ourselves that give up. And so how do we, I guess, overcome the perspective that we should be looking at people who haven't had the opportunity to be the manager of the company or the dean of a faculty, becoming the next level of management?
Okay, so I'm going to make you do a little bit of work. I want to know who's in academia. Put your hands up. And who's not in academia. Okay, thank you. So I think I'm speaking more to the non-academics right now. And recruitment is one thing. I think if you, as I said, have a rich and multidimensional slate, then you will hire the best person. But promotion is actually super important. And I think it's important to look at your firms, your organizations, and see who is in executive and who's in the pipeline to executive. And when you promote people, you're compelled to promote people that like make your life easy, make it comfortable, look like you. So I just challenge you to like think about that next time you're looking at promoting someone, and maybe you don't want to hire the next you. Maybe you want to hire like somebody who challenges you, and who can grow the position to something more. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Okay.
The other piece, sorry, I just
Sorry.
want to build on one comment as well, talking to the industry folks in the room too. When you think about bidding on contracts for company or for communities, one leading practice that I've observed is folks saying, okay, for a design construction project, we are going to dedicate that we are going to do our best to get 100% Indigenous people as contractors. In the design stage up until construction, they have about 3 to 4 years. So that means that company is going to train people for those 3 to 4 years to aim towards 100% Indigenous contractors when they get to the construction stage. So thinking differently about the fuller project management process and the fuller process, and where you have time to continue to help to train capacity along the way is also important. Plus, it does the benefit of aiding the community, giving back to the community, becoming a good neighbor, and playing in the sandbox for long-term results. Right, so I just wanted to put that practice out there as well.
Thank you, Jessica. I think we have, unfortunately, maybe one time, or no, Robert's standing up, so maybe we don't.
Well, I think this is a very important discussion. I am going to try and keep
Yep,
this on.
very good.
On schedule.
Okay. Well, maybe we could thank our fantastic panel. So thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Jessica. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. And I'm sure that this is going to stimulate a fair amount of discussion this evening and during the break. I'd now like to move to our last panel. So if I can ask David Wilkinson and Senator